Ms. Urvashi Butalia is a publisher, writer, and the co-founder of Kali for Women, India's first feminist publisher and now director of Zubaan. She is also the author of the award-winning oral history of The Partition, The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India. She started her career working with Oxford University Press in Delhi before briefly moving to London-based Z Books as an editor in 1982. She then returned to India and, along with Ritu Menon, set up Kali for Women in 1984. Her main areas of interest are the partition and its oral histories. She has written on gender, communalism, fundamentalism, and the media. Her writings have appeared in several newspapers and magazine publications, including The Guardian, The Statesman, The Times of India, Outlook, and India Today. Ms. Urvashi Butalia will speak to us today about the trials, tribulations, and joys of publishing Indian writing in English. Over to you, Ms. Butalia.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you very much, Meenakshi. Pramod, Anna, thank you very much. Dr. Murli, thank you for inviting us here. So I have been railroaded by Kartika into going first. You know, the thing is, we all know what the other one is going to say because we're all friends and we know each other well. So we kind of plan in our heads that I know Kartika will say this, then I'll respond to that. Now Kartika has stymied that. So, but anyway, okay. So my talk, and I did make some notes, it's going to be a bit biographical in nature. I'll be drawing on my experience as a feminist publisher of many decades and what it means to be publishing Indian writing in English. And that term, Indian writing in English, I'm going to interpret it a little bit broadly so that it encompasses a whole lot of things. It's also going to be a little bit boring because I'm going to talk about history a bit. But nevertheless, I think it's important for setting the context. And before I do so, I would like to say to Pramod, and I guess Anna, because I'm sure that both of you think the same thing, there is nothing a publisher would like more than open access and for the work to reach out to as many people as possible. But unfortunately, we are often cast as the bad guys. And we are not bad guys because we are also not a homogeneous community of people who are funded by usually men with very deep pockets, men who run corporations and who have very deep pockets, and whose primary motivation is profit. There are many of us who are in this business, if you like, for our deep belief in changing the way knowledge is understood, changing the way things are canonized, and bringing marginal voices to public attention. And unfortunately, even though you want those voices to reach out far and wide, that can't be done without putting money into the business. Our publishing, for example, barely breaks even year on year. Sometimes we run at a loss. But we continue to work because we believe in what we do. And if we are to make our resources available to you freely for sharing, whereas you have a fund and you have jobs that are paid, then somewhere we are doing the kind of work women do in their homes, which is undervalued, under-recognized, and not paid, and which basically keeps the world running. So I would ask you to think of that. Okay. Let me then start on my talk. Sorry for that little political speech, but I couldn't resist it. So I think from a publisher's perspective, it's important to understand both context and history when you're talking of Indian writing in English. When I entered the world of publishing long before any of you was born, it was in the 70s, Indian writing in English had a very, very limited meaning. There were a handful of writers who wrote in English. They were mostly published abroad, hardly read in India, and much publishing was dominated by textbooks. So there was no such thing as general publishing. There were hardly any publishers who published novels, poetry, nothing like that, although our market was full of those things, but those were mostly the rubbish that got published abroad did not sell and was sold as raddi in our country and was available on the pavements. So the Indian publishing industry in English was not an industry that had very many general books in it. The publishing market was not only dominated by textbooks, it also had really a limited number of publishers. So the scenario that you see today with large number of Western publishers who are over here as 100% Indian-owned companies, that did not exist then. A large number of independent companies that are around today, that did not exist then. The Indian English market was dominated by 3 or 4 publishers. They were the Oxford University Press, a company called Blackie and Son, Macmillan, and a company which today has, after going through many avatars, become Orient Black Swan, but which at that time was known as Longman Green, which then changed into Orient Longman and then changed into Orient Black Swan. So you can see the progression of that. So the market was dominated by these companies who mostly published textbooks for use in Indian schools. However, there was change afoot. And that change was that post-independence, when India stopped being a colonial country and became an independent country, the Indian state took a decision to Indianize everything. That is, what you hear today about Atmanirbhar is not a new concept. It was something that was introduced post-independence. Unlike most ex-colonial countries, India decided that we would build our own industry. And so when I was growing up as a young girl in India, you could not buy a single foreign thing in the country. There were only 2 kinds of cars. They were made by Indian companies. There was only 1 kind of refrigerator that was made by an Indian company. So it was a very different world from what you saw today. The domination of the knowledge market by foreign publishers was also complete, but when India decided to Indianize, they decided that they would Indianize everything, then publishing, literature, writing was also part of that. And one of the steps was to turn all the publishing companies that existed in India, which were foreign, only British, because we were a British colony, to turn them into Indian companies, which meant that the foreign company could still hold shares, but only 49%, up to 49%, so the majority was with Indian companies. The people who ran those companies, who were British men, slowly changed and Indian men took over. So when I joined publishing, my boss in Oxford University Press was an English guy. By the time I left that company, my boss had become an Indian guy and the English guy had gone. But it was still guys, but nevertheless, there was a process of Indianization going on. So, and also, of course, it's not to say that there weren't independent publishing houses, there were a few. There was one significant house called Asia Publishing House. But most of these houses, when they published general books, they published largely academic books. And they were focused on things like economics or history or politics, maybe science, but disciplines like ethnography, sociology, anthropology, had not cultural studies, had not yet made their way into the world of academia. So you had these books and the writers were mostly people like Nehru and XYZ and other well-known economists and so on. And the books by women could be counted on the fingers of 2 hands, if that. So mostly male-dominated, mostly foreign, mostly Indian powerful men. That was the shape of the publishing industry at that time. Once they started to Indianize, many challenges came up. And here I want to tell you a story, which is, I think, a very nice story, and also quite funny of how these challenges unrolled. In my own life, when I joined publishing, I joined in a very inglorious capacity as somebody called a paster-upper. The paster-upper's job was to take English textbooks, because in all our schools, the textbooks that were prescribed were English textbooks. And because that they had been published by British publishers, Therefore, those English textbooks were actually books brought in from England to India, not written specifically for India. Indian authorship had not yet developed. That took some time to develop. So therefore, most textbooks were English textbooks. And in school, we used to have a series of books, I still remember, called Active English. In Active English, all the children on whose lives this book was based were blonde and blue-eyed. They all lived in London. The cars they drove were British cars. They didn't drive, their parents drove. The buses in which they went to school were double-decker buses. In India, you had double-decker buses only in Bombay, nowhere else. So those books were culturally completely strange for India and Indian schools, but they were the only books we had. So publishers decided, Oxford University Press decided to Indianize those books. Indianizing meant changing the names. So the names of the children were John and Mary. John and Mary had to become Ram and Sita. So our limited imagination only allowed us to think of Ram and Sita. So John and Mary had to become Ram and Sita. Then John's golden hair and blue eyes and Mary's golden hair and blue eyes had to become black. And the double-decker buses in John and Mary's life had to become single-decker buses. So you had to cut off the tops of double-decker buses. So how was this done? I was employed as a paster-upper. My job was to take large sheets of paper which had which had Ram, Sita. Then I would sit with the book and I would cut out Ram and paste it over John. Now, John has 4 letters, Ram has 3. So I had to paste very, very carefully. Then I would cut out Sita and paste over Mary. And then there was an artist who was employed, and the artist's name was Dean Gasper. His job was to sit with a black pencil and color blonde hair black and paint blue eyes black. And then he would take bits of paper and paste them over the double-decker bus's top deck. And then we used to type with manual typewriters. And to correct mistakes with manual typewriters, you had to have a whitening liquid. So we used to paint it over. If we had typed a letter wrong or a word wrong, we would paint it over and retype on top of it. So Dean used to take that white liquid and paint over the double-decker buses and then redraw. And that's what we did to turn those books into Indian books until such time as authorship of textbooks in India developed and Indian writers were able to produce their own textbooks. I wanted to give you this bit of history so that you understand the context in which Indian writing in English, the genre which is known today as Indian writing in English, emerges. It simply did not exist then, barring some novels by Kamala Markandeya, Nayantara Sehgal, Kanthapura. Who wrote Kanthapura? Raja Rao, Mulkraj Anand, and later, Malgaonkar penned in the Ganges. I mean, you could actually count those names. Okay, so now let me jump several decades to the moment in 1984 when we started Kali for Women, the first feminist publishing house in India. So when Ritu Menon and I set up Kali, it was a given that we would publish in English. Both of us were the first generation to come after independence. Our education had been entirely in English. Our work experience had been entirely in publishing houses that published in English. Therefore, it was kind of, within quotes, natural for us to move into publishing in English. And therefore, we started to publish feminist books in English and put them out into the market. Also, our own experience of the market for books, because it's very important when you're publishing to be able to put books into a market, was the experience of the English market, which is very, very different from other languages. So by that time, in the early 70s, when I joined OUP, while this was happening to English language that we were Indianizing, no such thing was happening in the Indian languages. In the Indian languages, publishing had always been extremely vibrant and all kinds of books were coming out. And therefore, the market for those books was very different from the market for English, where putting general books into a market that is hospitable only to textbooks is a very difficult sort of thing to do. But nonetheless, because it was natural for us to publish in English, we started to publish in English. Now, very soon, although we did some wonderful books, which later turned out to be classics, and we loved the books, very soon the dilemma that was mentioned as the title of my talk began to manifest itself. And the dilemma was, for example, the birth of Kali was directly related to a very dynamic and extremely vibrant, extremely intersectional, extremely cutting across class women's movement in India. It was an amazing growing movement. All of us were involved in it. And the reason for setting up Kali was really, as an activist in the movement, I felt a real lack of material to read and understand the issues we were involved in. And I looked around me for material. At that time, there was no Google, no nothing. You only had books, and I found nothing. And I thought, okay, maybe this is something we need to do as activists in the movement, and that's why we set up Kali. But all of this activism was taking place in languages other than English. So how were we to actually start to reflect what was happening in the women's movement in India if we continued to publish in a language that was foreign to that movement and which only stayed with people of a certain class and therefore dictated literature of a certain type? And the reason I say this is that when you're writing in English as an Indian, at that time, today it's a different thing, you are bringing a sensibility which is not an English sensibility into a language that has no space, words, or empathy for the experiences you're bringing in. All of us, for example, grow up with filmy songs, and many of our emotions are expressed in Hindi or Tamil or Kannada or whatever, Telugu film songs. When we start to write in English, how do you translate Chaudhwi Ka Chand or something like that into the English language to give it the same flavor? So at that time, when people were still writing in what was considered, I suppose, pure or the Queen's English, you were not getting a lot of non-elite people writing in English. And therefore, we felt very strongly the limitations. And we could see, for example, that in Kerala, there was a huge, vibrant movement where authors were publishing themselves and they were translating Russian authors into Malayalam. In Maharashtra, there was a huge, vibrant movement that was taking Marathi literature to villages through publishing houses like Granthali and others. In Bengal, there was a huge literary movement where you could get children's books done by the Ray family or books done by the Tagore family, which were reaching out really wide. But what was happening in English? So as feminist publishers, we began to feel the limitations, and that's what kind of pushed us into looking at translations. And I know that we are not talking about translations here, but I do want to mention that because one of the dilemmas that attaches to an English language publisher who is a political publisher trying to reflect the multiple realities of India is precisely this. How do you continue to publish in that language? For me as a writer, that was also a dilemma because I had grown up in English. My writing is in English, but people often ask me, why don't you write more? And I know that the reason that till recently I did not write more was because something inside me told me I wanted to write in Hindi. But actually I was writing in English, and something inside me would say, this is not right. It has taken me this stage in my life when I am, probably going to live for not very much longer, to understand that that dilemma was a kind of false dilemma. Because in a sense, language chooses you as much as you choose a language. But that's just a by the way. So anyway, one of the excitements of publishing in English, however, dilemmas apart, because I said I would also talk about the joys, was that our books managed to make it into the national and international markets because they were in English in a way that Indian languages, and I refuse to call them regional languages, do not do. So, but the other interesting thing was that if a book of ours made it into the international market, for example, that's when it got noticed at home. Because in the home market, there were no structures by which books could get known. By this I mean, today you have a little bit, newspapers will talk about books, you have reviews of books, etc. We had nothing like that. So how would a book get known? There were no bookshops that kept books. There were actually a total of 100 bookshops, if that, across the whole country. At one time, the British Council did a study of Indian bookshops in India. They could not find, they wanted to get 100 bookshops and they couldn't find 100. So imagine in a country of, at that time, 1 billion people, 100 bookshops, what does that mean? So how do you actually sell books? So when Pramod talked about the business of publishing, I think this is also important to see how books get out, and yet English, still small though the market was, gave you national and international access. Okay, so that was one thing. Then the publishing of translations brought us another learning, that actually English wasn't some monolithic, homogeneous language which subscribed to something called the Queen's English. Today, of course, it would be the King's English. Rather, over the years, as writing in English grew, the English itself transformed and changed into a much richer language with a lot of cultural influences in it which came from, say, the Indian languages around it. So that raised another issue for publishers in English, because Indian writing in English, as you know, Rushdie, when his book Midnight's Children came out, Rushdie kind of popularized the use of Hindi, Urdu inside English as if it was normal. So you would be reading an English sentence and you would say, he went somewhere and did patak, and that would sound completely okay. But if you were to reach these books to the international market, how would you deal with those Indianisms in the book? And it raised the issue for publishers and publishers' editors, which I think the people who read books don't often think about, the little nuts and bolts and technicalities that go in, that should we be explaining these words? Should we be glossing them? Should we be italicizing them? Even things like that. And over a period of time, publishers have matured into realizing that actually the way in which a language grows and the ways in which that language is influenced by the social context around it and is owned by authors with confidence means that that language becomes itself and you don't really need to explain itself. And by this, I mean, for example, if you take something like all the endless numbers of training institutes that have grown up around us, which prepare students for competitive exams of different sorts, and which actually do the teaching in English and are reaching English to a class which is different from the elite class who earlier dominated English, then the use of English by these people is changing the language itself. And the more that it is used, the more it is normalized and the more it becomes acceptable. If you even look at dictionaries and you see the number of Indianisms in dictionaries over the years, you will see that more and more have come in and become normal. So right now, words like Pandit and Guru and all of those are part of English and you don't really need to italicize them. But similar training institutes, IITs, the kind of writing that came in because of the internet, all this began to change the nature of the language and the ways in which language was used, and also the entry of young people into the world of writing. So writing wasn't only a field dominated by the elite, it was also a field dominated by those of a particular age group, because it was felt that you could not reach writing until you had attained a certain kind of maturity. Nobody said this, but these are the things that went into the making of books. So over the years, the whole question of what English is as a language has changed, and publishers have also become much more confident now to be able to say, both at the national and the international level, that no explanations are needed. No italicization is needed to actually own the language and to write in that language with confidence. So if you look at Indian writing in English historically over the years, you will see these changes that I'm talking about. But these are changes that have not happened in the writing per se by itself. These are changes that have happened in the historical context in which this writing initially grew and in which it has now further developed. There is another element that enters this, which is also interesting and which for us became a very important thing. Our publishing as feminist publishers was focused on the voices of women, and it was also focused on the voices of those on the margins. We understood marginalization not only as the marginalization of caste, but also as the marginalization of religion, of location, of region, of caste, of class, of so many other things. So, for example, we began to publish from the Northeast. It was very important to us because we saw the entire Northeast as a marginalized region, but differentiated by the different states which had in them various levels of, if you like, engagement, development, whatever you can call it. So, for example, in the Northeast, Assam, which is the more powerful state, produces a lot of writing in Assamese, but Nagaland, which is a state in which the writing language is English, produces writing in English. So looking at the Northeast, and there's a particular kind of idiom that is used in Northeastern use of English, we began to publish a lot from there. We began to publish a lot from Kashmir, where again there was, as the new younger generation came in, they started to write more and more in English and started to write from the political experience of belonging to Kashmir, so that writing came to you with a different quality altogether, and so on. And one of the areas here was Dalit writing. Now, in Dalit writing and in Dalit movements, the owning of English is a political act. So, whereas in other spaces one might say that there seems to be an inherent kind of value judgment when one looks at English and when one looks at Indian languages, taking English somehow to be superior to Indian languages. No, I'm the other way around, taking Indian languages somehow, that if you write in Indian languages, you're more authentic, whereas if you write in English, you're seen to be somewhat deracinated and not quite authentically Indian. These things still obtain. But for Dalits, the use of English became a statement of power, access to education, and so on and so forth. But even within Dalit communities, the writing in English by women was different from the writing in English by men, because women traditionally still do not have access that easily to education, to language, to writing. They don't have the leisure to write, and so on. For us, therefore, publishing Dalit writings in English was an act that, or was an enterprise that required a whole lot of work with the author, which was careful work, which was work that in which you have to, let's say, work like a translator might work, keeping an eye open to empathy and sensitivities. And I'll give you an example here of a book that we just published, which is published in English, but it is a translated work from Bengali. It's a novel by a Bengali Dalit writer, which was translated for her by a Bengali Dalit teacher of English, a man who comes from her village. And therefore the sensibility, the idiom, etc. was very apt, very appropriate. And then for us to render it into English so that it travels to the international market, how were we to do that in ways that it could be understood in that market without giving in to the need to explain everything? This is a kind of dilemma that attaches to so much work that you do, which is of a political nature. And finally, I think I should try to close. What's the time? How much time do I have? Okay. So let me just see what else I have to say. I want to then give you, so what I'm trying to say really is that over the years, from those early beginnings where Indian writing in English was very, very limited, We have a situation today where Indian writing in English has changed drastically and now includes in it many, many voices that it would otherwise, earlier it would have been impossible to see over there. And those voices bring with them a sensibility in the language which is very different from what it was earlier. So they have changed and radicalized the language. They also bring into that language, into that kind of writing content which was otherwise foreign to that language. So the early English novels by Indian writers would almost all have been addressing middle class sensibilities or would have been orientalizing the poor in some way. Now you get a different kind of sensibility coming in, which is changing all of this. And yet, when you look at the markets where Indian writing in English is sold, and that is why something like this resource that you're doing becomes important, as long as you pay publishers, of course, because without that you're not going to get any of this material. But when you look at Indian writing in English in the market, what do you see? What is most visible? What is most visible is really only a certain kind of writing. And why is that most visible? So Karthika is going to talk about this in detail, but Karthika and I yesterday at Delhi airport were looking at a bookshop there, W.H. Smith. And the shelves had books by Amish Tripathi, Shashi Tharoor, Ramesh Menon, Chetan Bhagat, XYZ, I can't remember. All the books were by men. All the books were bestsellers. All the books were by powerful men. There was, I think, a few women's novels, but mostly they were foreign. And so everywhere you go, bookshops, airport bookshops, other outlets, this is what you see. And in the old days, in computers, the early computers, there used to be something called WYSIWYG. WYSIWYG stood for what you see is what you get. But actually, what you see is not what you get, because the reality of the richness of Indian writing in English, the diversity that is now part of it, the voices of women that now populate it, the voices of low-caste people that now populate it, Dalit voices that now populate it, tribal voices that now populate it, voices from marginalized regions, marginalized people. This is what enriches Indian writing in English, but this is what is not visible. You never see it anywhere, and so you think it doesn't exist. And therefore, for example, a resource, an online resource, which is showcasing Indian writing in English, in my view, I don't know how you're doing that, in my view, if I was starting that resource, I would start from the bottom. And I would start from all these marginalized voices and fill it with that, and then see these other guys, if they needed to come in there, because they don't actually, they are everywhere and they get pirated anyway, so you can pick them up for a few hundred rupees at a traffic light, etc., which is not a good thing, but nevertheless, they get pirated anyway. But these are the kind of voices that need to be there. So it is actually an extremely rich field today, and it has grown out of a fairly interesting history developed over time. But it is a field that it still, despite its richness, despite its diversity, it remains more or less invisible. And I think that's really the battle that we have to fight. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to this history lesson. I hope you found it useful.
Thank you, Ms. Butalia, for talking to us about the inherent and imposed prejudices and biases that make Indian writing in English visible or invisible. We will now open this up to questions from the audience. Yes, Roy. One sec.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Would you like to come to the slide? Yeah, or the speaker.
So you can just hit the mic. Sometimes we hit like this.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the enlightening session. I just had a response, not exactly a question. English is seen somewhat as second tier to writing Indian languages. As in, it is not seen as that being that authentic. I felt that when in the context of queer writing, at least many words in my mother tongue, many words that are related to the queer experience or queer experiences are considered as unparliamentary. So people trying to express something about queer experiences will have no resort but to depend on English. As in, were they to use the mother tongue or were they to use the native language, it would be what is called unprintable language. They wouldn't be able to express it as well. So I felt, I felt well, some classes of people did not have a choice when it comes to which language to use to express themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, where do you come from?
Kerala.
Kerala. So in some languages, for example, Assamese, for example, Manipuri, Manipuri actually, the queer experience is very much embedded in and part of the language. Because queerness itself is not something out of the ordinary. That is not to say that in its present day manifestations it isn't conflictual and it isn't often, queer people are not often subjected to terrible discrimination and often violence. But that experience is not foreign to the language. Okay? In other languages perhaps it is. So I take your point, but I'm saying that it's not necessarily true across the board. And that is the whole thing actually about India and Indian languages. And this whole business that I pointed out of English being somehow seen as less authentic than say Indian languages. In a sense it is, and yet it is much more powerful. And it is a language of aspiration, and it is a language of social mobility. So that's the real paradox over there. It's that you can, if you're writing in Hindi or Malayalam, and there's an English writer speaking, the Hindi Malayalam writer will be able to adopt the moral high ground that I am more authentic, I'm more in touch with reality. But the English writer is the one who will be known everywhere, and who the newspapers will write about. Any other questions?
And there was a symposium some months back, and we had a session on notice literature. And the resource person talked about why we don't have notice literature as a subject in many of the universities due to the lack of enthusiasms.
Due to the lack of
enthusiasms.
Okay.
And in this regard, I think what Zubaan, as well as his training on arguing on notice writing is quite commended. But for the Manipuri philosophy, I'm from Manipur, I can talk about Manipuri philosophy quite together. For the Manipuri philosophy, I feel that many of the texts are by popular existing poets, like from the electric poets of old or Haribo, for example. And for other states like the recent case with the Assamese this philosophy where there was call for outsourcing through Facebook and Instagram and all these courses. There is a lack of new courses in the Manipuri texts, and we were just saying how the bookstores are filled with existing poems, and there are visual texts in like this two of the notice influences, which is quite interesting. But for the Manipuri anthology, I find the translation also quite not up to what I expected, but also the texts filled with texts that are quite familiar with the Manipuri audience. So, can there be any chance of a Manipuri anthology part 2? As well as what are the sources for what are the sources for these states? Like for example, Manipur, we have a very strong and rich culture of written literacy getting efficient. But the other states like Mizoram, Nagaland, their literature was more or less polished. So what are the sources of like collecting text from like the novice sets, like and philosophy?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, as you know, that Manipur is one of the states in the northeast which I suppose is the most powerful in putting together associations of writers. You have for long had LACOL, the Association of Writers, and then a Women's Association of Writers, all of whom write in the local language, their own languages. You are absolutely right to say that there is an absence in anthologies of young writers. But the young, and there is another interesting thing there, that a lot of the young writers are writing in English. They are actually losing their own language and writing in English. That is also partly due to the fact that there is a lot of out-migration into places where English then becomes the lingua franca to communicate. So when writers write, they write in English. And you're absolutely right to say that there is a lot of poetry. Because young writers seems to be the form that they feel closest to. We, in our work, because we publish these anthologies from the Northeast, what we have found is that in the Manipur anthology, it was still a lot of the works had to be translated. Okay? But in the Mizoram anthology, for example, of let's say 40 pieces that are included there, maybe 3 are in Mizo. Everything else is in English. Of the Meghalaya anthology, 1 is in Khasi, everything else is in English. So increasingly, as the profile of writers is becoming younger, they are choosing to write in English. Although there is the unusual writer who will be bilingual in Khasi and English. And what they're doing is, you spoke of the visual, but a lot of the time what they do is also they bring in their own language into the English and it becomes an integral part of that storytelling. So there are these very interesting things happening in Indian writing in English, which I think are really quite remarkable, and I think really those are happening because of this point I was trying to make, because of the external changes around us. Migration is one of them, urbanization is another one of them, the loss of languages is another one of them, lack of education in our own languages, all of that. And Indian writing in English, I think, is reaping the benefit of that in many ways. And yes, there is absolutely a chance of another Manipur anthology, more and more. They will have to be. Yeah.
So my question has to do with markets and audiences, and I'm wondering if, from your history, it appeared that early writing in English was sort of presenting India to the world, right? And then,
Okay, I'll try.
Early writers were sort of had an external audience in mind, an English-speaking audience largely outside and then coming back to the English. Whereas more contemporary writing in English seems to be for other people who speak and read in English. And of course, there's also this group of writers who was published. So that's one thing how publishers are doing that. And the second sort of related question is is there a conflict between nurturing an audience where you find the gap that really marginalized, and as a publisher, this is a gap that needs to be addressed before writing, and the other is finding more engaging markets that already exist, maximizing optimizing.
Yeah, for your first question about the early writers writing let's say for an international market and it's in a sense feeling the need to explain India to the international market. See, that may have been the case, and that is something that really literary scholars can look at. As a publisher, it's I don't feel I have enough of a background or an understanding to say so, but I also feel that writers' motivations are a writer's motivations. I'm not sure how many, I mean, one of the things that people say in writing workshops is know who your market is, know who your reader is. But I don't think that you can ever really know who your reader is. You are writing because something impels you to write. And not to say that your writing and the content of your writing is not influenced by external developments, yes. So those writers writing in the post-independence moment, when Indian publishing is coming into its own, are they writing for international markets? They might well have been, because in the pre-independence moment, a lot of writers were writing for the international market, not fiction, but explaining India to the international market in order to say we are a country capable of ruling ourselves. Look at us, we've got these traditions, we've got so much, all the books published by Asia Publishing House were those kinds of books. They were part of the struggle for independence. And I think that needs to be appreciated, and so also the works of people like Nayantara Sehgal and others who were some of the early writers, that would have had that element in it. But I find it, I don't want to be critical of it. I read an article by Harish Trivedi in the papers the other day saying now will people be translating for the international market? I mean, so what? You can be publishing or you can be creating a product for the international market, it's okay. But if your writing is for the international market, then your critical asset writing for your own market is, I don't know, in some way morally better. So I hesitate to make those kinds of analyses or judgments, although I see why they would be there. Your second question now, just remind me what you said about.
Sort of creating.
Oh, right. Yes, I remember creating. So again, I don't quite know how to respond to that. I think there's no black and white there. I think that most publishers, and I don't mean only book publishers, but even if you look at newspapers, etc., there is a comfort zone within which you can continue to publish. That is the predictable comfort zone. So newspapers will say to you, people like lifestyle. But they don't like gruesome stories, so they don't like sad stories. There's no evidence to prove that. They haven't done research to find that out, but they just decided. So it becomes a self-perpetuating kind of thing. You keep on publishing for the market that you have, and you publish more of the same. Hence, more of Amish Tripathi, more of Chetan Bhagat, etc., enters the market. How do you break this by bringing in new voices? It's damn tough. And when we do it, you have to fight so many things. You have to fight the writer's expectations. She has seen what is happening with the big writers. She wants to be there. But you don't have the power as a relatively small middle woman, to make that journey for the writer. What you can do is bring her voice into the public domain. Then it has to struggle. It's a hierarchical relationship. It's the way power is located in the West, and we want to have Indian voices out there. We're fighting an unequal battle. So it's the same thing that you're fighting here. What does happen is, and Kartika knows this is my constant refrain, the moment the small publisher has done this drudge work and the hard work of bringing that writer to public attention, and if her name now gets even mildly known, then the big one's swooping, and everybody take her home. Now, you see a gap, you address the gap, then the gap moves into the mainstream, the alternative becomes the mainstream. As a publisher, this used to drive me mad. I used to get really infuriated because all of these writers, all the big women writers in India, Gitanjali Shri, Manjula Padmanabhan, Smita Arni, there's so many of them. They've all been published by us first. hardly any of them is published by us now. Not because they dislike us, but because big money is out there now. And that is, I mean, it's taken me years in publishing. So publishers also have feelings and, emotions and such like. So it's taken me years to accept the fact that as a feminist publishing, this is what we are fighting for those voices to get heard and become part of the norm. So now I'm happy about it. Earlier I used to feel really angry and I used to want to shout at my friends saying, who the hell do you think you are, etc. We did all the hard work and then, so in a sense you end up, the small publishers end up, in a way subsidizing the big ones by doing the work of identifying the gaps. I mean, if Navayana had not been there, would publishing on caste have been as significant as it is today? He opened that space and I think we have to acknowledge that. If Bali had not been there, would women's voices be so much a part of publishing as they are today? No. And self-praise is not a good thing, but I think we have to acknowledge that history. So in a sense that works and then it fills that gap and then it becomes the norm. Yeah, you had a question, I'm sorry.
I come from the department of IWE. So I was happy when you mentioned that you also gave a prize in India and the whole thing. So, two questions related to marketing. First, I wanted to know what is the role of the international prizes award, like the our book with original Great Samadhi, and then the School of Science. I have not to the board. And what I said that the English translation makes the original more readable and more interesting. Because very, very honestly speaking, the first 200 pages of Dina Devi's Great Samadhi in English, those really good, basic credit for me. But the second question, so my question is number one. What is the role of such awards, prizes? We take it as business. But the second thing is that it's very nice that you are given space to women writing. Are you thinking of coming to the or self-writing publishing?
Okay, thank you. So, I think people may not have heard the two questions. If I can just briefly repeat them. The first question was that sometimes...
The role of prizes.
Yeah, the role of prizes. And if I may, I won't say much about them because I know Pratika will be addressing that, right? So I'll just mention a little bit. And the second was, are we thinking of giving space to other languages? I think the role of prizes is actually variable. Some prizes get a lot of publicity for the book, and sometimes it results in quite high sales. So for Gitanjali's book, for example, the Booker drove the sales of both the Hindi and the English. The Hindi book also, apparently, in the first week after the announcement, they sold 30 or 35,000 copies. And remember that the book was published in 2018, so for 2 years it had been doing nothing. Nobody had noticed it. But when attention came to it with the award, then of course both Hindi and English moved. So that is the Booker. Okay, so it also depends on the award. There is another award that I sit on the jury of, which has more money than the Booker. But nothing happens with it because it doesn't have a huge publicity machinery to get it known. So until it gets known. And Indian awards don't necessarily make that much of a difference. There is an award called the JCB Award, which is great, gets a lot of publicity, gets money for the author. One of Kartika's authors won it 2 years ago, and she can tell you about the sales of that book, which were not huge, I know that. One of our authors was on the short list this year. Her book sold 1,326 copies. It's nothing. It's nothing. It would have sold that normally, you know. So it's not. I don't know if it's an easy question to answer that. And whether we are going to go into Hindi. But you made a very interesting point. You said that the English translation of Gitanjali's novel actually made that novel accessible to another readership who would otherwise not have had the Hindi to read it, because Gitanjali's Hindi is quite difficult to read. And also you asked, when you mentioned my saying I want to write in Hindi, but actually, you know, now I ask myself, why do I want to write in Hindi? It's not even my language, because I'm a Punjabi. So I should be writing in Punjabi and not Hindi. So I put that question aside, although I do write a little bit, but not that much in Hindi. Whether we'll be doing moving into Hindi, no. I don't think we have the knowledge, the skills to explore that market. And also there are a number of good publishers, good in terms of content, doing that work. So I think if we moved into it, we would not make a success of it. But what we are doing, which I think is one way of using English, recognizing the power of English and using it to open up Indian writing. We translate a lot of Indian writing into English. And now we are translating from English, so a lot of feminist content should be in Indian languages. We are doing that now through a subsidy someone gave us. So as a result, in the first year of that, we offer a translation grant. In the first year, 18 of our books were translated into 9 Indian languages. And this year it's 15. And that to me is really important, because the two-way traffic then in some ways changes the equations of the languages. And English is often the language, the via media through which people translate. You know, when we will, I meant to say this, so there was this book we published, the autobiography of a domestic worker, Baby Haldan. That book, written originally in Bengali and Hindi, translated into English, became a bestseller and is translated into 23 languages across the world. But the translations all were not from the original, but from the English. And translation purists will get very angry about that. But I think, yeah, it helps the book to get into the world. Why not? Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I just have a remark or question, I think. So, I've read an essay by the Italian author Urvashi where he talks about censorship not just through authority, but also through something which he calls noise. So, when there's a lot of irrelevant, which might be fake or true, information being disseminated by the people in power or even otherwise, it leads to something where we don't really see something which might be really important, but it just passes us by because we are bombarded by so much information from so many different portals. So when you talked about the bookstore which had books by powerful men primarily, do you also think that we are facing some? I mean, we see it in OTT as well, where there's so much of content being produced right now. So do you see this happening in Indian writing in English as well, or are we still far away from it?
You know, I think that there is, in earlier days, we used to think of censorship only in two ways, or one way. We used to think of censorship as an act of the state. And of course, it is true that it has primarily in our history been an act of the state, where the state has set up institutions like the censor board and others which have the, within quotes, moral authority to decide what is good for us to see and what is not good for us to see. Publishing has by and large been free of that. The kind of guidelines we have is, as long as the work we do is not defamatory or libelous or pornographic, we can continue to publish. But over the years, I think two things have happened. One is that with the growth of the internet, this kind of censorship has shifted. It's become A, very difficult to censor, and B, in some ways easier by having takedowns and by having, Elon Musk and others deciding what is worth putting up and so on. So that whole field is currently a very broad kind of area, and I don't know what one can say about it that would be easy. For example, the internet offered queer people, women, a space, initially a safe space, to even talk about their bodies, to express sexuality, something they couldn't do. Now that same space has turned into a violent space, with a different kind of violence taking place. There is no active censorship, but there is a different kind of censorship going on. Then, as we started to become globalized, another kind of censorship made its appearance, that is the censorship of the market, because the market then operates on its own logic, and the market is not interested in marginalized voices. So that's what you get in the kind of books that we saw over there. The kind of censorship you're talking about, I think I think you use the word censorship by choice, right? By noise. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that is something we all know that we are in imminent danger of, if the danger is not already there. We also know that some within publishing, I know this for a fact, within publishing, all of us are now being very much more careful than we were in the past to look at books. And publishers, of course, who can afford it, have lawyers who look at their books to see whether those books are okay to put out there. But that was never in terms of this. It was always in terms of the legalities I talked about earlier. But it is beginning to change. I hope not too much for the worse, but one can't say. It's really a known unknown, if you like, if one can use that phrase. It's a fear, and it's balanced against that fear is the hope that maybe you can find a way around it, maybe it can't, it won't happen. But there's no tip. There's really no tip. Okay, we're done with the questions.
Thanks, Urvashi. I'm sure there are many more questions, but we'll reserve them for the conversation in the afternoon.